Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to another exciting week of online learning. Um, just a couple of quick things before the fun and excitement begins today. And regarding your feedback on our online learning experience so far, I was reading through all those quizzes, and a lot of you guys like this. Some of you do not, but some people are really embracing the freedom that you have, and spacing this out or through the week, learning when you want to, even if it's at like midnight or 1 a.m., which some of you have commented, and I see when you're turning in your stuff, which is totally fine. And that's one of the benefits of online learning. You've got the freedom to do this when you want to, learning at your own pace, watching the videos, multiple times if you need to. Some of you are struggling without, face-to-face interaction, and that's, totally understood, but it is something we might need to get used to over the next few weeks as we continue this. So last week we did World War II. I don't think 5 days is enough to cover all of World War II. Hopefully you did watch those videos. Maybe you skimmed through the reading or read the reading, and you've got at least a decent understanding of what was going on, such a huge topic like World War II. If you had time to watch any of the videos that I posted or the movies that I posted, you can start to dig into a little bit of depth that is there. Just understand there are entire college classes where you can study World War II for like a whole semester. So we did 5 days. I don't think it's enough, but hopefully you got bits and pieces of it, or at least the fundamentals. As for this week, I'm focusing on the Cold War. And I'll continue with my routine that I did last week, where Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'll post lectures and closing questions. Thursday, I'll post a video. I'll try not to do something as long as last week, but Thursday, I'll post some kind of documentary video. And then Friday, I'll have another similar quiz. So that's the plan. And I know that you're all anxiously awaiting your moment with Matthew. And Matthew here is anxious to tell you as well some fun facts about the world. So here you go, Matthew.
Remember, there's 7 continents, and we live in North America.
Excellent. Can you show them the globe so they see? Oh, very good. Thank you, Matthew. And maybe I can get Charlie in here too. Charlie! Oh, here, Charlie's at the door. Hold on. Charlie, I think, wanted to come in. Come here, Charlie. Charlie, come. And let's see if I can show you Charlie. Charlie got a haircut this week by us. And, we're not dog groomers, so Charlie got a little bit of a flat top, but he's okay. He's a little more comfortable. He went in the pool the other day, so it was a little better for him. But here's Charlie. There's Matthew. They're going to say their goodbyes, and I'm going to start to lecture over the Cold War. Okay. Charlie, go take a nap. Matthew?
What's the Cold War?
Oh, the Cold War. I'll teach you later about the Cold War. Will you shut that door? Thank you. All right, people. Here we go. I know that you have all sorts of extra time, and probably in that time you want to be reading like a nice solid 300-page book over the Cold War, but this sums it up the best. I've read this multiple times. I've assigned chapters out of this. Basically, this John Lewis Gaddis guy breaks down like all of the fundamentals of the Cold War, and it really is a fascinating book. I know that you're probably not going to read this, but just be aware of this guy. This is the Cold War historian. This guy knows the most. And if you take college classes on it, this will be your go-to textbook. So he outlines it here kind of in that quote. Stalin, the guy we're up against, Stalin's post-war goals were security for himself, his regime, his country, and his ideology in precisely that order. Throughout his 300 plus pages, he takes you through in lots of detail about the escalation of the Cold War, and the number of hot wars which are actually going to be involved in this as well, that I will definitely cover. This is what I would say a lot of it is rooted in, a fundamental difference between American embrace and love of capitalism and the Soviet embrace of socialism. And the two just don't get along, which you can kind of see from this cartoon right here. I know you've heard capitalism, socialism, communism, democracy. You've heard all of that interchanged, but maybe not totally broken down what they mean. Well, let's look at this and try to understand it because, again, this is the root of the conflict that causes the Cold War. America, we like capitalism. Capitalism, according to capitalists, everyone has their chance at the money. You can see both these guys, yay, big pile of money, and they both have an equal chance at it. So that's kind of how we advertise capitalism. However, the socialists say, he made his money by taking it from him. He's exploiting the worker to make his money. So the socialists don't like capitalism. And again, the socialists want to rise up against the capitalists so that they can share the wealth. Socialism described by socialists, look at that. Everyone has their pile of money. Socialism, however, described by the capitalists, you took my money. So just kind of think of it that way. Where's the common ground between those two? There really isn't. And this is going to be the root of the Cold War conflict. So if you understand that we like capitalism, the Soviets like socialism, and there's no real common ground, I think you got a decent understanding moving forward. This one a little more wordy, but this will be the political differences between us and the Soviets. Politically, communism, that's not freedom for the people. In fact, there's no like individualism in communism where leaders are appointed, not elected. And you basically don't have any like free speech, no amendment rights under communism, no voting rights. And you'll see that everything free that we love is going to be repressed in communist Russia. So just again, I'm not going to read this to you word for word, but just kind of think communism, you don't get the right to vote, you don't have freedom. Democracy, you have all of those things. So we like democracy, they have communism. All right. This is something that we'll kind of go back to throughout this entire week in this chapter. Truman will be our Cold War president that we'll focus on. And Truman's going to have a lot of highlights here with some Cold War, let's say, flashpoints. This is a weird memory aid, but it always helps students in first remembering Harry Truman as the president during the Cold War. And if you can remember that weird statement on the screen, you can remember all of these kind of major issues that are involved in the Cold War. Truman's muscles brought nasty China across Korea. I'll explain all of these as we go through the week, but Truman's, you then remember Truman Doctrine. Muscles, Marshall Plan. Brought, Berlin Crisis. Nasty, NATO. China, China Communist. Across, Atomic Bomb. Korea, Korean War. I'll explain all of these in depth. Don't worry about that. But if you can just, again, remember that weird statement, Truman's muscles brought nasty China across Korea. I think that you can remember all of these things that are going on in the Cold War. So maybe at the very simple thing right now, Harry Truman is our Cold War president. Truman again took over once FDR died. Let's rewind when FDR is alive. But as you can see by this picture, he doesn't look too healthy. In fact, he's got just a couple months left to live at this point. This is where some of the Cold War tensions are beginning at this Yalta conference. There again, the big three. You got Winston Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And at Yalta, World War II is still going on. They're basically trying to discuss how to end the war. And the big thing to understand about Yalta is that FDR is a seasoned politician and he can get people to agree on things. He had done this his entire life. He could talk to both these guys, even though they have, radical differences in their political and economic ideology. FDR can get people to agree on things. So basically, through this entire conference, FDR, the man in the middle, he's getting Stalin to agree to things. He's getting Churchill to agree on things. And they're basically putting forth this plan to end the war and how to rebuild nations once the war is done. Now, one country to really keep in mind at Yalta is Poland, where we, as in kind of the democratic nations, we want Poland to be free. Stalin doesn't want Poland to be free. He wants Poland to be like a protector. just in case they're invaded again. He wants Poland to be a buffer controlled by the Soviets. So his sticking point is we want Poland to have free elections. And again, the wily Roosevelt is able to get Stalin to loosely agree on allowing Poland to be free. But here's the thing, there is conflict at Yalta, but FDR is able to smooth things over. Well, what happens, in April of 1945? He dies, and if you look at our next picture at Potsdam, Truman replaces FDR, and where's Winston Churchill? Oh, he was actually voted out, and Clement Attlee took over. So the only familiar face at Potsdam is Joseph Stalin. And let's just say that Harry Truman was no FDR in terms of seasoned politics and getting someone to agree on things. Harry Truman was very blunt. He was to the point. In fact, there was a moment at Potsdam where Truman whispered over to Stalin saying, oh, by the way, we've got this atomic bomb. Stalin already knew that. He had spies. So it was just this point of contention, and clear conflict was emerging. In fact, by Potsdam, Stalin broke all of his promises about Eastern Europe and did not allow free elections to happen. So without a doubt, the Cold War is happening by this Potsdam conference late in 1945. So there is conflict, but FDR is able to smooth things over at Yalta. When FDR dies, Truman, a little bit, of a bully, you could say, and no Winston Churchill either. We clearly have Cold War conflicts emerging and escalating by Potsdam because Stalin had broken his promises. So I know a wordy slide, but if I ask you what was the beginning of the Cold War, I think you got a pretty good answer in saying the Potsdam Conference, because Stalin broke his promises and Truman was no FDR. Here's another thing. Again, those philosophical differences, I noted that. But some actually argue the Cold War was beginning during World War II because Stalin was getting really angry at us because we were slow to open up a second front. He was bearing the full force of the Nazi expansion, and he was somehow looking for us to relieve all of that attack in the Eastern Front by opening up, say, D-Day earlier. We didn't do that until 1944. So Stalin was a little bit mad at us, and he knew that we were trying to develop an atomic bomb as well. So some say that conflict within World War II, that opened up the wound between the two, but maybe it was just escalated at that Potsdam conference, and the fact that promises were broken definitely leads to the Cold War. There again, Stalin, ooh, he doesn't look too nice. But this is weird, he was our ally throughout World War II. We called him Uncle Joe Stalin, but now that the Cold War is escalating, he's going to definitely be the bad guy. In fact, he was kind of a bad guy all along. He killed 20 million of his own people. Maybe they teach you some of that in world history, but again, we kind of brushed that under the rug during the war because he was helping us defeat the Nazis. So there's a lot more on Stalin, but let's just kind of think of him as a totalitarian dictator where he wants total control over everything. And he would not allow democracy because that's not total control. So he wants total political and economic control, not only over his country, but over all of Eastern Europe as well. In addition, there's no free speech, there's no free press. If you try to speak freely against him, you're eliminated, and you're not allowed to print anything against him as well. So all of that stuff will be opposed and not allowed. And if you are a political opponent, you're not going to be living under Stalin, so to speak. And again, the guy kills 20 million of his own people. So now we're clearly opposed to this guy, and that conflict will be escalating throughout the late 1940s. As you can see here, the map of post-war Europe, we've got a clear divide between our democratic capitalist kind of Western Europe countries, and here's Germany split down the middle, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. We have what Winston Churchill called an iron curtain has descended across the continent. So Churchill, he went on like a tour in the United States after the war. He was making a speech, and one of his more famous comments ever was, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Here's a political cartoon depicting that iron curtain. And you can see, like, Eastern Europe, ooh, bad over there. This guy's like trying to run away from it. These guys are in awe, taking pictures of it. So an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Please, by the way, don't confuse the Iron Curtain with the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall's not there yet. The Berlin Wall's in 1961. So Iron Curtain, it's more of a symbolic divide between communist and democratic, or socialist and capitalist. All right, what do we do about it all? A few really important concepts. You got to note this guy, George Kennan. George Kennan, he basically wrote this long letter which outlined our policy, which we'll embrace for the next several decades, called containment. We want to contain communism wherever it is. We feel that if we contain it, it will eventually die out. So we cannot let it spread. Now think your way through this. If we are to contain communism and not let it spread, is that going to increase our involvement throughout the world? Absolutely, we're going to be everywhere in the Cold War years. So for us to contain communism, let's say we hear there's an outbreak in Southeast Asia, we've got to be there to contain it. We can't let it spread. George Kennan's idea of containment will get us really involved as this international policeman for the next 40 plus years. Here's the first kind of statement of our involvement, this Truman Doctrine, part of your Truman's Muscles odd memory aid. So the Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman made a speech. Greece and Turkey were looking to potentially fall under Soviet pressure. The British previously had supported those two, but the Brits are running broke. So now Truman says, all right, we will help you. We will help free people fight communist aggression anywhere, anytime, any place. And we then commit $400 million to the military aid of Greece and Turkey. Holy cow, that's huge. So just understand this Truman Doctrine, we're promising to help free people anywhere, anytime, any place. We're going to fight communist aggression. And that, again, specifically applied to Greece and Turkey, but it was such a bold and broad statement. We're going to be everywhere in the Cold War years. So we have to contain it. We can't let it spread in Greece and Turkey. So we're now going to pay the bill. In fact, speaking of paying the bills, this is going to be a huge one. We're going to pay the bill for European recovery. This Marshall Plan is huge, and just kind of think it's an American aid package designed to help Western Europe recover. And if you think about this, it's going to start to make sense, because if we're paying for the recovery, they're not going to go into a chaotic, desperate state. Think through history. What happens in times of desperation, despair, absolute chaos? Did we learn this at the end of World War I? What happened throughout the entire Depression? Who tends to rise up in times of desperation and chaos? Well, you get extremists, totalitarians, dictators, and ideas like communism or socialism sound appealing. So if we are to flood Western Europe with money, it's more likely to promote stability, democracy, and capitalism, which we want. So this Marshall Plan, it actually works very, very well. Maybe world history touched on it, but just kind of understand, for us, it's a dramatic departure from the end of World War I, where we did nothing. In fact, we wanted our money back, and we're trying to promote recovery rather than, things that lead to chaos. So containment, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, pretty important slide here. Please try to remember a lot of those details, especially if they're involved. A few political cartoons about it. This is kind of questioning our new role, our new Truman Doctrine, where the new American foreign policy, that doesn't really look like a stable bridge. It's more of a slippery log with a blindfolded Uncle Sam with his aid to Greece and Turkey, and he's wobbling a bit. He might fall in the ocean. This, however, is more of a positive depiction of the Truman Doctrine. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, put that in your pipe and smoke it, but that's what this is basically suggesting. The Truman Doctrine in Stalin's pipe, well, it's going to blow up in your face, Stalin. That's going to fix you. So one of them kind of questioning our new role, one patting Truman on the back for standing up to the communists. There again, the Marshall Plan, you see the amount of money lent to Western Europe. It's not going to Eastern Europe. So again, Stalin had, total control over these guys, but we are going to promote Western Europe recovery. And if you look over the next 30, 40 years, Western Europe definitely will recover. So can he block it? Well, no, not to Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, he's going to have absolute control. Okay, again, kind of a wordy slide, but a good summary of other landmark changes after World War II. And there's so much out there. Probably the biggest one for us to focus on is right here, the United Nations. Again, you guys got to think back to the end of World War I. After World War I, there was a plan for an international peacekeeping organization, the League of Nations, but that was a miserable failure, especially when we did not join. This United Nations, however, it works, we're in, we're still around. And there are a lot of parts of the United Nations that remain influential throughout the 20th century and even to today. A few other little side notes. They want to organize kind of monetary policy and economics to prevent another depression. And one other kind of interesting part of this is that they all agreed to lower tariffs. You guys remember that Hawley Smoot-Hawley tariff, the highest in history, and how bad that got for the world? This GATT, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, everyone basically says, hey, let's lower tariffs, and that will promote recovery, reduce trade barriers, and be good for all. So just a few notes here. Again, big focus on the United Nations. You got to know something about that. All right, there's one event that definitely crystallizes the Cold War. And again, here's like, oh no, the Soviet bear, communism, it's going to spread around the world. And they were indeed trying to spread. The Soviets had influence in the Middle East. What's happening in China? Oh, well, China's about to go communist, but more on that later. Our primary focus on kind of the first major Cold War crisis, it's going to be in Germany. And if you recall from world history, Germany at the end of the war was divided into 4 quadrants. So just kind of think 4 military occupation zones where the Soviets, they've got this red sector, and then the rest of the Allies have Western Europe. So we've got the Brits, we've got the French, and we've got our sector. But the major problem with Germany is the capital. What's the capital of Germany? Berlin. Oh, that's in the Eastern Bloc. So here's Berlin, and that too is divided into 4 sectors. This is where Stalin freaks out because he does not want Western influence in his sector. So just understand that you're going to have a major development of the Cold War by 1947, really over Berlin, which is in the Soviet sector. So just focus on this problem of Germany. And maybe you remember from last year what's going to happen with Berlin. He blockades it. So the Soviets, Stalin, will surround Berlin and they try to starve Berlin into submission. They want to take it all. We actually considered war. That probably would have been World War III. So rather than drop bombs, check out what we're dropping. Milk, the new weapon of democracy. We have an airlift. And we actually have a very successful airlift. For about a full year, we're dropping supplies into our sector of Berlin. And we're, somehow keeping them alive, afloat, and eventually Stalin's going to, end this entire blockade. So this U.S. airlift, the Berlin blockade, Berlin airlift, it marks the first true crisis of the Cold War, where again, some were ready for World War III at this point. More calm minds prevailed in simply dropping supplies rather than bombs, which was probably a good thing because it was surely going to get ugly at that point if we went into World War III. So anyway, by 1949, you have the permanent division between East and West Germany. That will stay until 1989, if you recall, when the Berlin Wall falls down. So just note, first true crisis of the Cold War. As for NATO, while this is going to be a major difference compared to the end of, let's say, World War I, and just kind of understand when you see NATO, you got to think of good old George Washington. You at all recall George Washington's farewell address, what he warned against? I'm hoping that you recall he warned against permanent alliances, and he, warned about that in 1796. Here we are in 1948. Make sure that you understand that NATO marks our first permanent alliance, meaning if any of these blue countries are invaded, we got their back. We're still in NATO today. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And again, understand that it's our first permanent defense alliance. It is our end to the historic isolation that had been around really from our origins. And now it's, going to put us in a fight if any of those are attacked. What would George Washington think? He probably would be rolling over in his grave. And you guys remember those irreconcilables who hated Article X, which this basically was another part of, at the end of World War One. These guys would have hated it as well. So another dramatic departure compared to the end of World War One. We're now in the fight, committed to the fight. The Soviets, they want their cool pack as well. So they've got a response to NATO. They come up with a Warsaw Pact. Now that one has dissolved today, but NATO still is around. So just understand, permanent defense alliance still around, still relevant today. The Soviet response, well, that fell apart when kind of the Soviet Union fell apart. Almost done. Let's note Japan, that's a different story. So Japan is defeated, but they're allowed to have their emperor remain just kind of as a symbolic guy who's not going to have any power. The guy with all the power in Japan is General Douglas MacArthur, the guy who said, I shall return to the Philippines. He is now going to reconstruct Japan from the ground up. And the Japanese actually would cooperate. This reconstruction promoted rapid recovery, and by the 1960s, Japan was an economic powerhouse that had, you could argue, fully reconstructed, and it was just kind of our forced reconstruction that they cooperated with. But let's note, MacArthur, he's the one making them rebuild, and it actually worked well. Now, we falsely assume this template is going to work around the world in all future wars. It definitely does not. Not all countries want to cooperate with reconstruction, and you can kind of connect the dots to modern day. We're still struggling with how to rebuild the Middle East, just kind of thinking, oh, well, it worked in Japan. It surely will work everywhere else. No, that's not the case. Every country kind of has a different role and a different story, but we falsely assumed this would work everywhere. All right, last slide. Let's again note that a lot of different causes to the Cold War. If you read that John Lewis Gaddis book, there's a long chapter on how we even had this proposed loan to the Soviet Union, and then we stopped the loan, and that caused even more conflict. So historians love to debate the precise cause of the Cold War. I would say for our class, if you guys understand the Potsdam Conference, you're in pretty good shape. And again, the Potsdam Conference, no more FDR. You've got Harry Truman. You've got kind of the bullying type personality of Truman, and Stalin broke his promises at Potsdam. So for our case, let's note Potsdam. So Yalta, Potsdam, both important. Hopefully you got those. And as for our memory aid, we cover the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan today. So Truman Doctrine, it's our pledge to fight anywhere, anytime, any place. And the Marshall Plan, think Marshall money. Marshall money, Marshall money. We shower Western Europe with money. Dramatic departure from the end of World War One. We're in the United Nations. We're in NATO. We promote world trade. We've got massive military spending as well. What did we do at the end of World War One? Did we build up our military at the end of World War One? Nah, we disarmed, we sold our Navy. Now we're going to go into like a permanent warlike economy. So just think dramatic departure from the end of World War One, and we can kind of call that a day. Let me know if you have questions. Please post questions. I'll post my closing questions for you in a second. And again, just kind of pace yourself through the week. I'll go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday lectures. Thursday, I'll give a documentary, and Friday, I'll do another similar quiz. Feel free to email me. Feel free to post on Classroom. By all means, let me try to help you through this kind of difficult process. Hope you have a good day. And again, let me know if you have any questions.